The receiver of the landline phone felt heavy and cold in my hand, like a stone picked up from the bottom of a river, but the weight in my chest was far heavier, a crushing pressure that threatened to stop my heart right there in the middle of my sun-drenched kitchen. 200 guests. The florist on the other end of the line was chattering away enthusiastically about floral arches, white hydrangeas, and the logistical challenges of navigating the delivery trucks up my gravel driveway, completely oblivious to the fact that he was tearing my world apart with every cheerful sentence. He was talking about a wedding, my son's wedding. A wedding that was apparently taking place on my property, at my home, on the land I had bled for, in exactly 4 days. And I knew absolutely nothing about it. I stood there, frozen, staring out the window at the rows of olive trees shimmering in the California heat, feeling the humiliation wash over me like a tidal wave of ice water. It wasn't just the surprise, it was the erasure. My own son, Julian, and his fiancée, Bianca, had planned the most significant event of their lives on my territory, without simply asking the owner if it was permissible. To them, I was not the owner. To them, I was not the matriarch who had carved this paradise out of dust and debt. To them, I was invisible, a piece of furniture that came with the house, a ghost in my own life. I was the housekeeper. Still, after all these years, after all the blood, sweat, and tears, in their eyes, I was still just the help. I hung up the phone with trembling hands, interrupting the florist mid-sentence with a vague excuse about a bad connection. I needed to sit down. I collapsed onto the wooden chair at the kitchen table, the silence of the house suddenly deafening. My eyes wandered to the framed deed on the wall, the paper yellowing slightly at the edges, bearing the name Elena Rosales. 72 years of life, and 40 of them spent on my knees. I looked at my hands, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the skin mapped with the history of labor. These hands had scrubbed the toilets of the wealthy in Beverly Hills. They had polished silver for women who didn't know my name, ironed shirts for men who looked through me as if I were made of glass. For 40 years, I woke up at 4 a.m. to catch 3 different buses. I ate lunch standing up in utility closets. I endured the scolding of bosses who treated their purebred poodles with more affection than they showed me. I saved every dime, denying myself new clothes, vacations, and simple pleasures, all for one singular, impossible dream: to own a piece of the earth that no one could kick me off of. When I finally bought Terra de Rosales 7 years ago, it was a neglected dust bowl. The farmhouse was rotting, the soil was parched, and the trees were dying, but it was mine. I poured the last of my vitality into this soil. I revived the olive grove, planted the vineyard, and painted the farmhouse a crisp, defiant white. This was my sanctuary, my kingdom. And now, Julian was treating it like a public park, and treating me like the staff he expected to clean up the mess. I remembered the weekends they would visit. They never brought groceries. They never offered to help prune the vines or fix a broken fence slat. They would arrive with their loud friends, commandeer the patio, drink my wine, and leave a trail of dirty dishes and empty bottles for me to deal with. "Mom, we need more ice," Julian would shout from the pool, not even turning his head. "Elena, do you have any of those appetizers left?" Bianca would ask, her voice dripping with that saccharine sweetness that barely masked her entitlement. And I, paralyzed by a mother's desperate love and the fear of losing her son, had always obeyed. I served. I cleaned. I smiled. I swallowed my pride until it tasted like ash in my throat. But as I sat there in the kitchen, listening to the humming of the refrigerator, something inside me finally snapped. It wasn't a loud explosion. It was the quiet, terrifying sound of a steel cable breaking under too much tension. The florist's call was the final straw. They had sent out 200 invitations with my address. They had hired vendors. They had planned a spectacle on my land, assuming I would just quietly fade into the background, prepare the guest rooms, cook the recovery brunch, and be grateful for the scraps of their attention. No more. I reached for the phone again. My hands were no longer trembling. They were steady with a cold, unfamiliar resolve. I dialed the number for Sterling Elite Events, the the most prestigious, high-end corporate event planning firm in Los Angeles. I knew of them from my days cleaning the mansions where they organized galas. They were ruthless, expensive, and impeccable. "Sterling Elite, this is the director's office," a polished voice answered. "I need to speak to Marcus Sterling," I said, my voice surprising me with its authority. "I have a venue for his emergency request." I didn't know if he had an emergency request, but men like Marcus Sterling always had a crisis to solve. When I was connected, I pitched him the offer of a lifetime. "Mr. Sterling, this is Elena Rosales. I own the estate in Ojai, the one with the panoramic view of the valley. I understand you have a high-profile technology client looking for absolute privacy for a retreat this Saturday. My farm is available." There was a pause. "Mrs. Rosales? This Saturday, that is? Incredibly short notice. We usually require months of vetting." "I will give it to you for $5,000 for the day," I said, cutting him off. "But you must bring the full setup: security, catering, the works. I want the property to look like a fortress of corporate efficiency, and you must arrive at noon sharp." Marcus was silent for a moment, calculating. He knew the location. He knew its value. "Done. We'll send the contracts over within the hour. Electronic signature?" "Send it," I said. When the email arrived, I signed it without hesitation. $5,000. It wasn't about the money. It was about the contract. It was about the legal binding that said this land was occupied. I was renting my home to strangers to keep my own family out, and the realization brought a twisted, sorrowful satisfaction to my heart. The next 3 days were a blur of manic energy. I cleaned the house not for a wedding, but for a business deal. I polished the floors until they looked like glass. I pruned the roses with surgical precision. I wanted the estate to look breathtaking, not for Julian, but for the strangers who were paying for the privilege of being there. Every time the phone rang, and it rang constantly with confused vendors confirming wedding details, I let it go to voicemail. I didn't answer Julian's texts. I didn't answer Bianca's calls. I was busy. I was a businesswoman. On Friday afternoon, the confrontation I had been avoiding, or perhaps courting, finally arrived. I was in the garden, deadheading the hydrangeas, when I heard the crunch of gravel. Julian's sports car skidded to a halt near the barn, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on my freshly washed car. He stormed out, looking flustered and annoyed, with Bianca trailing behind him in high heels that sank into the soft earth. "Mom!" Julian shouted, marching towards me. "Why aren't you answering your phone? The caterer is freaking out. He says he can't get a hold of you to confirm the kitchen layout." I didn't look up from my flowers. Snip. A dead bloom fell to the ground. Snip. Another one. "I've been busy, Julian." "Busy doing what?" he demanded, stopping right in front of me, blocking my sunlight. "The wedding is tomorrow. We need the house ready. Did you clear out the guest rooms for Bianca's parents? And we need to move your furniture out of the living room to make space for the dance floor." I finally looked up. He was handsome, my son. He had his father's eyes and my stubborn chin. But right now, all I saw was a stranger who thought he owned me. "I haven't moved anything, Julian, and the kitchen isn't available for your caterer." Bianca stepped forward, her face a mask of confusion. "What do you mean, Elena? The wedding is in less than 24 hours. We have 200 people coming." "I know," I said calmly. "The florist told me." That was how I found out, by the way, from a stranger asking about delivery access. Julian rolled his eyes, a gesture so dismissive it made my blood boil. "Oh, come on, Mom. Don't be dramatic. I forgot to mention the specific details, okay? I'm sorry, but we're here now. It's family. It's our special day. We just need you to pitch in like you always do." "Like I always do," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the words. "You mean serve you? Clean up after you? Stay invisible until I'm needed?" "You're twisting things," Julian snapped. "Look, we don't have time for this emotional stuff right now. Just tell us the kitchen is open so I can call the caterer back." I stood up straight, wiping my hands on my apron. "The farm is rented tomorrow, Julian. I signed a contract with a corporate client. They arrive at noon." The silence that descended on the garden was absolute. The birds seemed to stop singing. Julian blinked, his brain unable to process the information. Bianca let out a small, strangled gasp. "You, what?" Julian whispered. "I rented the farm," I said, my voice steady. "Sterling Elite Events is hosting a corporate retreat here. They paid $5,000. The property is exclusively theirs, from noon until midnight." "You can't do that," Julian yelled, his face turning a violent shade of red. "It's my wedding day. We sent invitations. People are flying in." "You sent invitations with my address without asking me," I countered, my voice rising for the first time. "You planned a massive event on my property without a single conversation with the owner. You assumed. You assumed that because I am your mother, I have no rights. You assumed that because I spent 40 years cleaning floors, that is all I am good for. Well, you were wrong." "Fix it," Julian hissed, stepping closer, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Cancel it. I don't care what it costs. Call them and tell them the place burned down. Fix this, Mom." "I cannot," I said. "It is a legal contract, and frankly, I do not want to." Bianca burst into tears. "How can you be so cruel? We're family. You're ruining my life." "Family treats family with respect, Bianca," I said, looking at her weeping form without the usual urge to comfort her. "Family does not treat their mother's home like a public banquet hall," family asks. "Family includes." "I'll pay you," Julian said desperately. "I'll pay you the $5,000. Just cancel it." "It's not about the money, Julian," I said softly. "It never was. It's about the fact that you only offer to pay when you are desperate. You never offered to help with the roof repairs last winter. You never offered to pay for the water bill when you filled the pool 3 times in a month. You only value this place when it serves you." "I hate you," Julian spat out, the words landing like physical blows. "If you don't fix this, I swear you will never see your grandchildren. I will cut you out of my life completely." The threat hung in the air, toxic and heavy. The grandchildren card, the ultimate weapon. My heart cracked, a deep fissure running through the center of my chest. But as I looked at him, this man who was willing to blackmail his own mother rather than admit he was wrong, I realized that giving in now would only validate his behavior. If I surrendered, I would be the doormat forever. "Get off my property," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but hard as diamond. "Both of you, now." They left, screaming insults, tires spinning in the gravel. I watched them go, and then I went inside, locked the door, and slid down against the wood, sobbing until my throat felt raw. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but the war was just beginning. The next morning, Saturday, dawned with a cruel, beautiful brilliance. The sky was a piercing blue, the kind that makes everything look sharp and high definition. I rose at 5, out of habit, and dressed in my best suit, a tailored navy blue ensemble that I usually saved for church. I put on my pearls. I applied lipstick. I was not the housekeeper today. I was the landlady. At 10 o'clock, the chaos began. The wedding vendors started arriving, a parade of confused delivery drivers. The cake lady, the DJ, the rental company with hundreds of gold Chiavari chairs. I stood on the porch, a sentinel at the gates. "I am sorry," I told the DJ, a young man with a backward baseball cap. "There is no wedding here today. The venue is booked for a corporate event." "But lady," the order says. "The order is wrong. The groom did not have permission to book this venue. You will have to contact him." I turned away truck after truck. The confusion was palpable. Phones were buzzing everywhere. I could feel the panic radiating from the other end of the invisible lines connecting these drivers to Julian. At 11:30, Marcus Sterling arrived. His team was a military operation, black vans, men in earpieces, sleek furniture that smelled of leather and money. They swept into the garden, setting up a minimalist, high-tech environment that contrasted sharply with the rustic charm of the farm. They were professional, respectful, and efficient. They treated me like a partner. "Mrs. Rosales, the space is magnificent," Marcus said, surveying the valley view. "My client will be very pleased." "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I said, standing tall. At noon, the guests began to arrive. Not the corporate guests, they were due at 1, the wedding guests. They came in droves, dressed in pastels and suits, looking for the ceremony. They parked on the grass, confused by the lack of wedding signage and the presence of security guards in black suits. I stayed on the porch, watching the disaster unfold. It was agonizing. I saw cousins I hadn't seen in years. I saw neighbors. I saw Bianca's frail grandmother being helped out of a car. They wandered towards the house, only to be stopped by Marcus's security team. "Private event. No entry," the guards said, their faces impassive. "But we're here for the wedding," an aunt cried out. Then Julian and Bianca arrived. They had clearly spent the night trying to find a backup venue and failed. No one books a venue for 200 people on a Saturday morning in October. They looked wrecked. Bianca's eyes were puffy, her makeup hastily applied. Julian looked pale and frantic. They pushed through the crowd of confused guests and ran toward the porch where I stood. "Mom, please!" Julian screamed from the bottom of the stairs, ignoring the security guard who tried to intercept him. "Stop this! Everyone is here! Look at them! You're humiliating us!" "You humiliated yourselves," I said, my voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "You invited 200 people to a house you do not own, for a party you did not ask to throw." "We'll do anything," Bianca sobbed, her white dress stark against the dusty path. "We'll pay rent. We'll sign a contract. Please, Elena, don't do this to us." The corporate guests began to arrive then. Limousines with tinted windows navigated through the cluster of confused wedding guests. CEOs and tech moguls stepped out, looking bemused by the chaotic scene. The clash of worlds was absolute. Father Gabriel, the priest who was supposed to officiate, stepped out of his car. He was a man I had known for 20 years, a man of deep wisdom and gentle eyes. He took in the scene: the weeping bride, the shouting groom, the stone-faced mother, the corporate security, and he walked straight to me. "Elena," he said softly, coming up the stairs, "this is quite a situation." "It is necessary, Father," I said, though my heart was breaking with every tear I saw Bianca shed. "Justice is necessary," he agreed, "but mercy is divine. They have learned a hard lesson today, Elena. Look at his face. He is not arrogant anymore. He is broken." I looked at Julian. The father was right. The entitlement was gone, stripped away by the sheer magnitude of his failure. He looked like a little boy who had lost his mother in a supermarket. He looked terrified. "He threatened to keep my grandchildren from me," I whispered to the priest. Father Gabriel sighed. "Fear makes people say terrible things, but if you destroy him today, completely and irrevocably, that threat might become a reality not out of spite, but out of shame. He will never be able to look you in the eye again. Is that what you want?" I looked at the corporate setup in my garden. I looked at the wedding guests sweltering in the heat. I looked at my son. I held all the power. For the first time in our relationship, the dynamic had shifted completely. I was not the servant. I was the judge. "I want respect," I said, "and I want terms." "Then dictate them," Father Gabriel said. I walked to the edge of the porch. "Julian, Bianca, come here." They scrambled up the stairs, hope and terror warring in their eyes. "Here is the deal," I said, loud enough for the nearby family to hear. "The corporate event has the property until 6 p.m. That is non-negotiable. Mr. Sterling has a contract. However," I paused, looking at Marcus Sterling, who was watching with fascination. I had spoken to him briefly earlier about the possibility of a shorter timeline if things went well. "Mr. Sterling," I called out, "if I offer a 50% refund on the venue fee, would your clients be willing to conclude their retreat by 4:30? Marcus smiled. He loved a good deal, and he loved drama. For a 50% refund, I think I can persuade them to wrap up early. They have a dinner reservation in Santa Barbara anyway. I turned back to my son. The wedding can happen at 5 o'clock, but there are conditions. Anything, Julian breathed. Anything, Mom. 1, I said, holding up a finger. You will pay me $2,000 for the use of the venue today, plus the refund I just gave Mr. Sterling. You will write the check now. Yes, Julian said immediately. 2. Going forward, You will pay a monthly maintenance fee if you wish to use this property for any personal recreation. You will never, ever show up without calling first. And you will treat me as the hostess, not the help." "We promise," Bianca said, nodding vigorously. 3, I said, and this was the hardest part. "During the reception, I will make a toast, and in that toast, I will tell the truth. I will explain exactly why there was a delay today. I will explain that you did not ask for permission. I will explain that this happened because you disrespected me. I will not lie to cover your shame. You will own it." Julian went pale. Public humiliation was a high price for a man with an ego. He looked at the crowd of guests, then at Bianca, and finally at me. He saw the resolve in my eyes. He saw that the doormat was gone, burned to ashes, and a matriarch stood in its place. "Okay," he whispered, "I deserve that. We accept." The next few hours were a bizarre, miraculous ballet. The wedding guests were redirected to a local park to wait. The corporate event proceeded with ruthless efficiency. My garden was filled with discussions of stock markets and mergers, while my kitchen was prepping for a wedding banquet. At 4:30, the black vans pulled away. The transformation began. Family members who had been waiting in the wings rushed in to help set up chairs. There was no florist anymore, he had left hours ago, so we cut branches from the olive trees and placed them in vases. It was simple, rustic, and frantically assembled. At 5 o'clock, the sun was beginning to dip low over the mountains, bathing the valley in golden light. Julian stood under the old oak tree, waiting. Bianca walked down the aisle, not to a string quartet, but to a hum of silence and reverence. The ceremony was short, poignant, and heavy with the weight of the day's near disaster. When it was time for the reception, tables were set up under the stars. The mood was subdued but grateful. People were just happy to be there, happy that the disaster had been averted. Then, the moment of truth arrived. The speeches. I took the microphone. My hand was steady. I looked out at the 200 faces, at my neighbors, my family, and my son. "Good evening," I began. "I want to welcome you to Terra de Rosales. Many of you know how hard I worked to buy this land. You know I spent 40 years cleaning houses to afford this view." There were nods in the audience. "But what you might not know," I continued, looking directly at Julian, "is that today almost didn't happen. We are starting late, because this wedding was planned without my knowledge. My son and his bride sent invitations to my home without asking me if they could use it." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Julian stared at his hands. Bianca looked down at her plate. "I rented the farm to a corporation today to teach them a lesson," I said clearly, "because for a long time I felt invisible in my own family. I felt that my hard work was taken for granted. I felt that I was seen only as a pair of hands to work, not a heart to be respected." I paused, letting the words sink in. The silence was absolute. "But," I said, softening my tone, "today, my son and daughter looked me in the eye and made a promise. They promised to see me. They promised to respect this land and the woman who owns it. And because I believe in redemption, and because I love them more than I love my pride, we are here." I raised my glass. "To Julian and Bianca, may your marriage be built on communication, on gratitude, and above all, on respect. Because without respect, love is just a word." The applause that followed was thunderous. It wasn't polite applause, it was real. People were crying. Julian stood up, walked over to me, and hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he wept into my shoulder. "I see you. I swear, I see you." 6 months have passed since that day. The vineyard is turning gold with the autumn chill. Life at Terra de Rosales has changed. The business with Marcus Sterling took off. He was so impressed by my handling of the situation that he now books the estate for exclusive retreats once a month. I have a steady income, more than I ever made scrubbing floors. I hired a gardener, so I no longer have to do the heavy lifting myself. But the biggest change is in the family. Julian and Bianca come over for dinner every Sunday. They call on Wednesday to ask if Sunday works for me. When they arrive, they bring wine. They bring groceries. Bianca insists on doing the dishes, and she actually scrubs the pans properly. Last week, Julian came over alone. He found me on the porch, drinking coffee and watching the sunset. He sat down beside me, not taking up space, just sharing it. "I was thinking," he said, "about the roof on the barn. It looks like it needs some shingles replaced. I'd like to pay for a contractor to come out and fix it, as part of my contribution." I looked at him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet maturity. He finally understood that this land wasn't his inheritance to squander. It was my legacy to honor. "That would be nice, Julian," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "Thank you." I looked out over my olive trees, their silver leaves dancing in the wind. I had fought for this land. I had fought for my dignity. And finally, at 72 years old, I wasn't just the woman who cleaned the house. I was the woman who owned it. And more importantly, I was the mother who had loved her son enough to stop enabling him, and in doing so, I had saved us both.